Good morning, everyone. It's always exciting to be asked to come home to speak. It was about 9 o'clock yesterday morning when I received a text from Pastor John asking me if I could come on short notice. And I didn't think about it. I didn't pray about it. I just said yes. And then checked with my home church. I'm a door worker at, like you, Kathy, at my home church in Kings West, West St. John. And then I asked him, all right, may I be excused tomorrow? And he said that would be fine. So I cannot believe that it's been 2.5 years since I left here as your pastor. So 2.5 years later, and I'm not a day older. All right, everything else I say this morning will be true. Except that. That's not quite true. And I'm guessing that this would be the first time I've ever spoken at Crosspoint when my sister Betty was not in the room. As most of you would know, Betty McCollum, my sister, went to be with the Lord just a little over a month ago. Just seems different to come to the city and she's not here. Now, Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable and pleasing in your sight. Amen. A young married couple approached me at the close of a service with these words, "Pastor John, have we got a story to tell you?" Well, I knew it was a good story, and I knew it had to be an amusing story because of the huge smiles I saw on their faces, and their story went like this. Our 5-year-old, Melina, came home from church last week telling us that she saw Jesus and that Jesus had spoken to her. And she was very matter of fact, but she was adamant when we questioned her on it. She said, "Yes, Daddy, yes, Mommy, it's true. I saw him and he spoke to me." So they went on with their story. They said, "We were puzzled and pleased, but we said no more. And then this morning when we came into church and sat down, and it was time for you to preach, you came up on the platform, and Melina said, 'That's him. That's Jesus.'" Now, I would like to think that Melina mistook me for Jesus because she thought I was a lot like Jesus. But as I think about it, I realize that her thinking probably went like this. They're always talking about Jesus at this church, and that guy up there is talking to us all the time, therefore he must be Jesus. Well, I do claim to be a follower of Jesus, and it's my goal and it's my prayer to think his thoughts, speak his words, act as he would act. Is that your prayer and your goal too? Pastor Charles Sheldon wrote a book in the year 1896 entitled "In His Steps." The subtitle of the book is "What Would Jesus Do?" WWJD. And that book has sold over all of the years since 30 million copies. I believe it's because it struck a chord of response in believers all over the world. Why? Well, if we're going to follow Jesus, shouldn't we do what Jesus did? About 30 years ago, the abbreviation for "What Would Jesus Do?" WWJD was wildly popular in the United States and Canada. It was placed on wristbands and worn by millions of Christians, especially youth. Now, I suppose I could conclude this sermon now, which would please some of you, I imagine, by simply saying this matter of following Jesus is ultimately a matter of answering the question, what would Jesus do, and then doing it. But I'd like to take you a little deeper than that this morning and spell it out for you. So come with me now as we walk through a grain field. We're in Matthew chapter 12. And we're going to consider for these next minutes this matter of following Jesus. What's it about? So Matthew 12 reads, I believe the words are on the screen behind me. At about that time, Jesus was walking through some grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. But some Pharisees saw them do it and protested, "Look, your disciples are breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Jesus said to them, "Haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, and he and his companions broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests are allowed to eat. And haven't you read in the law of Moses that the priests on duty in the temple may work on the Sabbath? I tell you, there is one here who is even greater than the temple. But you would not have condemned my innocent disciples if you knew the meaning of this scripture. I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. For the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." Then Jesus went over to their synagogue, where he noticed a man with a deformed hand. The Pharisees asked Jesus, "Does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath?" They were hoping he'd say yes, so they could bring charges against him. And he answered, if you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? Of course you would. And how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Yes, the law permits a person to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored just like the other one. Then the Pharisees called a meeting to plot how to kill Jesus. And now let's take a little closer look at those words that I just read to you as we consider this matter of following Jesus. I want you to notice 5 things this morning, and the first is this. This matter of following Jesus, it's not a matter of following rules. It's not a matter of following rules. As we just read, the chapter opens with Jesus' followers, his hungry followers, his disciples. Apparently, they were oblivious to what rules might apply in their circumstance. And they're walking through a grain field, breaking off heads of grain, eating. And meanwhile, these fanatic, frenzied Pharisees, most certainly they were not followers of Jesus, but enemies, criticized the disciples. The words we just read, his disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off heads of grain and eating them, but the Pharisees saw them do it and protested. You see, these Pharisees, they knew the rules. Actually, these Pharisees, they were known as guardians of the law. They were teachers of the law, and they were meticulous about keeping the law right down to the last detail. And when I say they were keepers of the law, I don't just mean the Big Ten. I'm not just talking about the Big 10 Commandments. You see, the Pharisees knew and they taught and they kept hundreds and hundreds of laws. All the laws written in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, they kept the moral law and the dietary laws, and there were cleanliness laws. Plus, there were all the oral tradition laws. That means all the spoken laws that had been passed down through the centuries. Now we're up to countless number of rules. And there were 39 actions that were forbidden on the Sabbath day alone. And among the rules that they had to keep were the reaping rules and the winnowing rules and the threshing rules and the preparing a meal rules. And the disciples broke all 4 when they broke off the heads of grain. When they broke the heads of grain off, that's reaping. When they rubbed the grains between their hands, that's winnowing and threshing. And then they ate them and prepared a meal. You see, these obstinate, obsessive Pharisees reduced worshiping and honoring God to following laws and rules, and they totally missed it. They totally missed it. This matter of following Jesus is not a matter of following rules. The owners of the American fast food chain, Chick-fil-A, have a policy, maybe many of you knew this, a rule, I guess it is, against Sunday openings. But you could say about them that they're not pharisaical about it. Their stance has some, what you could say would be wiggle room to it. For Chick-fil-A, an exception occurred on Sunday, December the 17th, 2017. On that day, the Atlanta International Airport was hit with a complete blackout. And it resulted in hundreds of canceled flights and countless hungry and stranded passengers. The city of Atlanta then scrambled to try to find accommodation and food for the passengers, and they tweeted these words: Chick-fil-A will provide food for the passengers. Chick-fil-A owners, who, by the way, are Christ followers, realize that this matter of following Jesus isn't just a matter of arbitrary following rules. And yet these smug, self-righteous Pharisees in Matthew 12 were very diligent about keeping the rules. Oh, they kept the rules, and they couldn't have been further from God, the Father. Now, the lesson for us is obvious there, isn't it? We can be careful to live upright, moral lives. We can be a good person and be just in all our dealings and still miss it. We can. This matter of Jesus, you see, is not a matter of following rules. Well, the second thing I want you to notice from this passage is this. This matter of following Jesus, it's certainly not a matter of making sure other people follow the rules. In verse 2, we see it. Some Pharisees saw them do it and protested. Look, your disciples are breaking the law. Are these Pharisees ever going to be with us? These grain field gripers, not only were they strict rule keepers, they were all about making sure that everyone else kept the rules too. Later in our story, in verse 10, we just read it, the Pharisees are at it again. The synagogue, Jesus had just left, and he was in the synagogue, and he noticed a man with a deformed hand. The Pharisees asked Jesus, does the law permit a person to work by healing on the Sabbath? They were hoping he'd say yes so they could bring charges against him. Now, it needs to be said perhaps here that the scriptures are useful to correct us when we're wrong. Paul wrote that to Timothy. But that is to be done kindly and firmly and gently and lovingly by those mature in the faith, and usually by those assigned in the church to do that kind of thing. But these fault-finding, critical, judgmental, condemning, malicious Pharisees, they were just in the business of making sure everyone followed rules. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus spoke these words that are probably familiar to all of you. Do not judge, and you will not be judged, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by you too will be judged. And why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of the speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own? You see what Jesus is saying here? He's cautioning all of us. He's saying to all of us, don't judge people. For one reason, you're not good enough. And for the second reason, Jesus is telling us we're not smart enough. We do not know what other people are dealing with when we're inclined to look at them and make a judgment about their behavior. And yet, the Barna Research Group, that's kind of like the Gallup poll people, only inside the church. They did an extensive study a few years back that they were trying to find out what people outside the church think of those inside the church. And here's one of their key findings. 9 out of 10 outsiders, 87% to be exact, said that the the term judgmental accurately describes Christians. I read that. That makes me sad. A few years ago, I spent a week at the Bowery Mission in Lower Manhattan. They house and feed homeless people there, and they had a truck that they would use to go out into the neighborhood to take food to the parks and so on. And the church, the van had a big sign over the top that said, "Fishing for Men." And then down lower by the bumper, it said these words, "We catch them and Jesus cleans them." Now there's the right approach for the church to take today. This matter of following Jesus is not a matter of following the rules, and it's certainly not a matter of making sure other people follow the rules. Here's number 3. There are 5. Number 3, this matter of following Jesus is a matter of doing the sensible thing. It really is. And I take you back to verse 1. His disciples were hungry, so they began breaking off some heads of grain and eating them. Jesus was with them. Jesus knew about all the Sabbath rules. He certainly did. And yet the disciples were hungry, so what did they do? Well, they did the sensible thing. They started to eat. Later, in the synagogue, Jesus said to these Pharisees that were being critical of his disciples, "Come on, you guys," he's saying, "if you had a sheep that fell into a well on the Sabbath, wouldn't you work to pull it out? Of course you would. You'd do," Jesus is saying to them, "Come on, you guys, you would do the sensible thing." Hear me, this matter of following Jesus is a matter of doing the sensible thing. I grew up in this church here. My dad moved here to pastor this church when I was but 9. But reflecting back, this church had a strong, well, I'll call it what it was, a strong Pharisaical influence inside this building. I was in a Sunday school class as a boy, 11, 12, 13, 14, and there were probably 12 to 15 other boys in that class. But by the time we reached 16 years of age, they were all gone, except for 3 of us, and one was my brother Fred, who's here this morning. And I reflect back on why is that so? And I think it was largely due to the rules that we insisted on, and many of those rules made no sense. If someone were to say to me as a kid, it always troubled me, "Well, why do you do that?" And I would say, "Because the church says so, not good enough." They were not sensible. It's quiet in here. Playing with playing cards was forbidden. When I asked why, as a child, I was told, well, they're used to gamble, and gambling is a vice, so we don't use them because gambling is evil, then the cards themselves are evil. Come on, that's not sensible. That makes no sense at all. And the movie theater, absolutely forbidden. Cinderella, doesn't make any difference. Sound of Music, Mickey Mouse, doesn't make any difference. When I asked why, I got an answer that went like this: well, there are some shows that come to the theater that they aren't fit to watch. Well, that's still true today, isn't it? Does that make the building evil? And it made no sense to me. I had the feeling when I was a kid, I used to love ice cream, but I thought, this tastes so good, it must be something wrong with it. Must be evil. Listen, this matter of following Jesus, come on, it's a matter of doing the sensible thing. And I'm afraid, back in those years, at least at times, our approach to people with harmful habits, they knew they were harmful, the people that had habits that were killing them, hurting them. Our message was largely this, as I remember it: get your life cleaned up and then come and join us, which has never been the church's approach, never should be. Hear me, and it certainly wasn't Jesus' approach. And how like Jesus is, I don't think Crosspoint, I know Hope City offers the CR program. We offer it at our church in St. John. What a tremendous program. For anyone with a hurt or a habit or a hang-up, well, then you all ought to go, right? That would include every last one of us, I think. But the message for CR is to the world out there, no matter what you've done, and here's the phrase I don't think we included so much in the church of my youth, or no matter what you're still doing, you're welcome here. Come on in. We'll help you the best we can. Don't you see it? This matter of following Jesus it's a matter of doing the sensible thing. Well, here's number 4. This matter of following Jesus, it's a matter of doing the loving thing. It went right over these angry, arrogant Pharisees' heads when Jesus looked at them and bluntly said, I want you to show mercy, not offer sacrifices. Can I translate that for you in 2023 language? Jesus is saying to them, I want you to do the loving thing, not stick to your heartless rule following. That's what he's saying. Jesus is saying, to love is the highest law, you guys, don't you see? Loving others ought to take precedence over every other rule that you guys think is so important. That's Jesus' message to the Pharisees. You know, sometimes we can even get confused about what loving people really means. Last February, not this February, a year ago, in the days leading up to Valentine's Day, the Toronto Zoo, for a donation of $25, said, if you'll donate $25 to our zoo, we'll name a cockroach after your ex. And then they included this: roses are red, violets are blue. Is there someone in your life who's bugging you? Name a cockroach after them. Well, it might be humorous, but it's anything but love. According to Jesus, we're supposed to, if you have an ex, you're supposed to love them. Well, Jesus left no doubt what he meant by doing the loving thing, as we just read, right? Then he said to the man, hold out your hand. So the man held out his hand, and it was restored just like the other one. Are you watching The Chosen these days? My wife and I have tremendously enjoyed. First 3 seasons is on Netflix, I think, and then the first season on Netflix. The next 2 are on the Angel Network, which is free. You can go there and watch it. I just watched that episode where Jesus healed the man with the gnarled hand. It was just awesome. For Jesus, doing the loving thing wasn't complicated. It was simply doing the loving thing. It really isn't complicated. It's simply finding hurting people and helping them. After telling these deaf, defiant Pharisees that if your sheep fell into a well, you'd get him out on the Sabbath, making the point that, come on, you guys, be sensible, do the loving thing here. And then Jesus added these words, and how much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Let me pause there just a minute. Do you understand how much value God the Father puts on you? Do you? You can't even measure the value that he attaches to you. Rick Warren, now retired pastor of that great church in California, Saddleback, was speaking to a prison audience of 5,000 inmates. And he said, nobody was paying attention to me because I had no platform. I was on the same level as they were, and I had a microphone. But he said the good news was that the microphone could be heard all over the yard, so all 5,000 could hear me if they wanted to hear me. So he said, I pulled out a $50 bill and held up the $50 bill and said, how many of you would like this $50 bill? And he said, I had 5,000 guys' attention then. And a cheer went up. And then he said, I spat on the $50 bill. And I threw it on the ground, stomped on it. And I said, and then he said, I picked it up and held it up and said, how many of you still like this $50 bill? And the crowd cheered. And then he really did a job on the bill, put it on the ground, ground it into the ground with his, now it's all ripped and torn, and he picked it up and held it up a third time and said, how many of you would still like to have it? He said, huge cheer went up. And then Warren said, now for many of you, this is what your father did to you. You've been mistreated. You've been abused. You are misused. You were told that you wouldn't amount to anything, and you've done a lot of dumb things. You've sinned. You've done some crimes, and you're paying for them. You've been beaten. You've been torn. You've been dirty. But you haven't lost. You haven't lost 1 cent of your value to God. Do you have any idea how much God loves you? And he loves to help the hurting. William Barclay, Bible scholar, making the same point, puts it this way. We will not be judged by the number of church services we have attended. We will not be judged by the number of chapters of the Bible we have read. We will not be judged by the number of hours we've spent in prayer. We will be judged by the number of people we have helped when their need came crying to us. This matter of following Jesus, it's a matter of doing the loving thing. And here's the fifth and the last this morning. Here it is. This matter of following Jesus is ultimately a matter of acknowledging Jesus Christ as Lord. Ultimately, that's what it is. Jesus stood face to face with these blind and broken Pharisees. Jesus stood eye to eye with these guys and said to them, I just read it to you moments ago, I tell you, he said, there is one here, he's referring to himself now, there's one here who is even greater than the temple. And then he said just a bit later, a sentence or two later, for the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. Wouldn't you think at this point that those Pharisees would drop to their knees and cry out, it's you, you're him, you're the Messiah, you are Lord? Wouldn't you think? In a TV commercial from just a few years ago, a young man is struggling whether to go through with an arranged marriage or not. Back in his home country, arranged marriages, that means dad and mom choose the bride for the son, the groom for the girl, so on. And it's all settled. They have no say. And he's wondering whether to go through with it. But after living in America, it's not the way it's done in America, Canada, he was having second thoughts about whether he should adhere to this ancient custom, especially since he'd never met his wife-to-be. Still, when she flew into the airport, he dutifully showed up, flowers in hand, gloomy expression on his face. But when she stepped through the terminal, everything changed. Suddenly, his glum demeanor disappeared, and the thought of marrying this woman was no longer a dreaded duty, it was a delight. What had changed? Just one thing, he saw her. And those Pharisees, so lacking, so lost, they could not see him, even though he was standing right in front of them. They couldn't see him for who he was, the Creator. There stood in front of them the Creator God of the universe in human form, and they couldn't see him. And he stands before you today. Still today, he stands before us. Can you see him? How will you respond? Hear me this morning. This matter of following Jesus is ultimately a matter of acknowledging Jesus Christ as Lord. Have you done that? Will you do it today? And if you have done it, wouldn't you like to declare it and declare it loud and strong today? Did you know that the very first creed of the Christian church was not the 107-word Apostles' Creed that we sometimes say? Some of you have it memorized. No, the original creed had just 3 words to it, just 3. And everyone who claimed the name Jesus, everyone who claimed to be a follower of Jesus was, you hearing me? Required, expected to declare it in loud voice. And so I'm going to ask you to do that, if you will. Loud and clear, Jesus is Lord. Would you say it with me? Jesus is Lord. Well, that was a bit strong in the front, weak in the back. Say it with me. Do you mean it? Jesus is Lord. Praise his name.